It is really a pleasure to be here in Dublin. Obviously, I know Lorraine very well, but there's also quite a number of other familiar faces. And usually I come here for PhD 5 hours, but it's actually really nice to give kind of a talk as well. So as we are in a school of agriculture, predominantly agriculture kind of research, we thought it would be nice to kind of give some results of my Scottish government-funded program on seafood and health. And hopefully during my talk I will be able to kind of get different perspectives from the different fields kind of in something that I think is quite timely at the moment, and I will tell you why during my presentation. So just to give you a brief overview of what I will be talking about, obviously about fish consumption, what we know, how it is healthy for humans. But also, if we come to recommendations, is there actually enough fish to go around for people kind of to eat? And I will actually kind of give a bit of information on that as well. We have recently finished a large trial where we actually combined the sustainability aspects kind of with the health-giving properties of fish. So I will discuss some kind of the results we recently got, and I will finish with what are the current recommendations and are they still fit for purpose in the future. So this is actually kind of something that was published by the BBC kind of last year in September, and this is about kind of a new kind of Homo naledi, which was found in Africa. And this is actually quite interesting because if you see and this links to fish consumption, as we believe, because this was actually one of our early human, was there before the human kind of erectus, the human Neanderthalensis, and the human sapiens, Homo sapiens as we know now. And as you can see, it looks very similar, but the brain cavity is actually relatively small compared with a modern human skull. And there is the general belief that actually obviously the brain cavity is linked to intelligence. And there is a general belief that actually the skull, the brain cavity started to extend when kind of modern tool making was introduced, when the language was introduced. But there's also kind of fossil evidence that actually kind of the change from kind of a smaller skull to a bigger skull actually happened when humans started to move from savannas to kind of an interface between kind of land and sea. So kind of humans actually got access to seafood. And they think that perhaps kind of the start of the intake of dietary fatty acids, especially DHA, has helped to facilitate kind of the enlargement of the brain. And obviously we know that DHA is very important for kind of brain development, especially during the early years. So this was actually the very first evidence of potentially kind of health benefits of eating fish for human development and evolution in this perspective. But most of the evidence, as we know now at the moment, is about the health benefits of fish is actually coming from studies that were done in the 1970s by Bang and Dyeberg, who were the first to kind of associate kind of fish consumption with cardiovascular health. So what they found in the Inuits, they obviously have a very kind of a diet, very high fish consumption. They had much lower kind of levels of cardiovascular disease. So this was just an observation, it was just an association studies. But since then there have been thousands and thousands of studies that actually kind of done cohort studies, prospective studies, intervention studies, where they have confirmed that actually there are health benefits relating to kind of eating fish. And at the moment, I think you, especially in the media, they're always coming with kind of health claims. Not all of them are necessarily very robust. But what we can say, especially kind of based on the fish fatty acids, kind of omega-3 fatty acid, EPA and DHA, they protect against stroke and lowers the risk of mortality from coronary heart disease. So this has been proven in quite a number of studies, and also meta-analysis, this comes out quite a strong effect. But I have to say that most of these effects are actually not because people are eating fish, as people taking the fish oil supplements. So most of these studies have been done kind of as part of supplement studies. But we know that fish is actually kind of much more than just EPA and DHA. So in addition to these fatty acids, fish is also the most important dietary source of vitamin D. So obviously vitamin D is essential for the growth and maintenance of healthy bones, and possibly it's linked to kind of outcomes of cardiovascular health as well. In addition, kind of fish is also an important source of micronutrients. I've listed a couple: selenium, zinc, iron. There's also iodine and vitamin B12, for example. So, and these serve various functions in the human body. So, and it is kind of, if you look at the different fish that people eat, they also have different kind of compositions. So oily fish would be particularly rich in omega-3 fatty acids, but it is particularly the shellfish who are actually very rich in micronutrients. So by actually mixing the different fish kind of on your plate, you actually get kind of the different kind of nutrients that are kind of in this slide. So if we look at specific outcomes of cardiovascular health, because we're always trying to find the underlying mechanisms, how can we explain why fish is actually reducing cardiovascular disease? There are a number of outcomes that people have looked at, and what Darius Motsavarian has done in this slide, he's looked at the intake of EPA and DHA, the fish fatty acids, and he's looked at the relative strength of the effects. And if you look at the doses, these are probably doses you could obtain through eating fish in your diet. And these are the doses you would not be able to kind of get through your diet by eating fish. You would need to take supplements. So if you look, for example, antithrombosis, which is an effect that can be established in weeks, but you would actually, the strength of the effect is not very high, and you would have to take quite a lot in order to establish an effect. And that would definitely have to be more than 3 grams per day. If you look at blood pressure lowering, not a huge strength of effect, but it's actually you can obtain those by dietary means. And the same for heart rate lowering. Then fish is known to and fish oil fatty acids are known to lower triglycerides, and there's even now a pharmacological intervention to lower triglycerides. But actually you would need to take quite high doses, often up like 2 grams, 3 grams per day in order to see your triglycerides lowering. It is an established effect, it's very robust, it's probably one of the most, significant described effects of fish and fish oil supplements. But yeah, you have to take higher doses. And then there is the effect on antiarrhythmia, which is mostly there because of a big trial called the GISI trial, where they were giving people aspirin and fish oil supplements. And the dose of the fish oil supplements was actually not that high. So they think there is a strong effect with relatively low doses, but it's still disputed whether actually this effect is actually then having a knock-on effect of risk of cardiovascular disease. So, and obviously you have current dietary recommendations. These are for the United Kingdom, but I think they're not that much different for Ireland. So in 1994, and this is really based on the content of EPA and DHA in fish. So these recommendations in first instance were based on the amount of EPA and DHA in fish. So there was a recommendation made in 1994, that was the UK Committee for Medical Aspects of Food Policy, the COMA, and they said people should eat really 2 fish a week, of which 1 is oily, and again, introducing the oily fish because of the EPA and DHA content. And that was reinforced by Sakan in 2004. So if you would eat 2 portions of fish, 1 oily, 1 white, that would be about half a gram of omega-3 fatty acids per day. And this is very much in line with what on the international levels people think they should be eating. So about half a gram is for prevention of cardiovascular disease. But really, if you want to treat patients for hypertriglyceridemia or other outcomes of cardiovascular disease, you really need to supplement, and the doses will be higher than 1 gram. So this, what I said, the recommendations are very much based on the level of EPA and DHA, and that has recently changed because now a couple of countries have come out with new dietary guidelines that is not based on EPA and DHA, but it's actually based on mostly this study of Zhang, which was published in 2012 in Public Health Nutrition, where they look at fish consumption and total mortality. So they haven't looked at what kind of fish people are eating, they're just looking at how many fish they eat, like whether it's less than 1 per month, which was a control group, and then 1 per week, or 2 to 4 per week, and they've looked at total mortality. And as you can see in the first figure, there is actually quite a benefit of eating fish, and it is reducing the risk quite significantly. So basically, either a low intake, which is 1 serving per week, or moderate intake, which is 2 to 4 servings per week, has a significantly beneficial effect on the prevention of coronary heart disease, mortality, reducing the risk by 16 and 21%. So that's actually quite dramatic. But they've also shown, although there's quite a bit of noise, because actually obviously it depends on the dietary assessment method. Here it depended on whether they adjusted for energy intake or whether you were a man or a woman. But they said actually if you eat 20 grams per day, which is equivalent to 1 fish per week, or 80, which is equivalent to 4 fish per week. So there's actually much more benefit of eating more fish than 2 or 3 or 4. So actually you can get most of the effect with relatively low doses, 1 or 2 fish a week on total mortality. So this completely disregards whether the fish is oily or whether it's white. It just says eating fish. So quite a number of countries now, they've said, okay, we're not going to recommend specifically oily or white fish, we just recommend fish, and people can decide themselves what they want to eat. So I will now continue to say like, oh, okay, if the recommendations are 1 or 2 fish a week, do we actually have enough fish to go around for those people to kind of maintain their health? So if you look at sustainability per se, there's actually a number of issues we should consider. Obviously, first is fish stocks, and I will elaborate a little bit more on that in the next couple of slides. That is important, and we had some huge issues with that in the last decades. Another outcome of sustainability is greenhouse gas emissions due to primary production methods. So this could be related to kind of wild catch fisheries, it could be related to aquaculture. I will not really go into detail about that in my talk, but if you were interested in this, like CFIS has actually kind of published 2 kind of really nice papers on this, and it tells you a lot about kind of, because they have to kind of, they want to be more sustainable, so they really have to kind of adhere to strict regulations. But there's also greenhouse gas emissions kind of linked to the cooking of fish. And I think there, it's where the fish has a benefit compared to, for example, kind of beef or chicken, because often fish, the cooking times are a lot less. But it is a bit of a variable area, because it really depends on, for example, kind of whether people are cooking on gas or electric, and there's a lot more to it than just simple calculations. And then the last one is actually the actual cost of fish for the consumer, because if you can actually produce it very sustainably, but then the cost is really high, then the long-term sustainability of increasing fish intake is still not there. So I will give a bit more information about the fish stocks and what the situation is at the moment. So obviously there has been a lot of this issue in the press in the last 2 decades, and it is important because we are facing a food security challenge. We have to feed the 9 billion people, and how are we going to do that? There are some serious challenges, especially in relation to fisheries. So we have the overexploitation of fisheries, but we also have the effects of climate change, which will undoubtedly affect the fish stocks in the future. So with overexploitation, obviously we mean overfishing, which is fishing beyond the maximum sustainable yield. And for every fish stock there is in the North Sea, we have this maximal sustainable yield figure. So just a little bit about overfishing from the popular press. There was this book that was published by Charles Clover. He is a Daily Telegraph kind of journalist in 2004. And we also had a film made in 2009, which actually kind of really dealt with this very kind of issue of overfishing. But we've also seen some other publications, the Aquaculture now, which is actually quite negative about the whole kind of wild catch fisheries. And the role of China, this was kind of published in Scientific American. Kind of China obviously kind of is responsible for a lot of the wild catch worldwide, and they really don't have any regulations at the moment. So if somebody has to kind of start working on it, it's probably going to be China. But also in the academic press, they've actually been quite critical about the whole topic. So obviously, especially in relation to fishery reforms, the common kind of fisheries policies, has been really criticized in the academic press. So designed for failure, they didn't think it would work. Fisheries mismanagement, again, they didn't think it would work. And I think there is some evidence that the common fisheries policies has worked, and I will show that in the next slide, which I borrowed from a colleague of mine, Paul Fernandez, who's very much into kind of looking at stocks. And here you see the stocks of some North Sea areas in 2002 and in 2011. And the red kind of circles are kind of stocks that are overfished, and the green ones that are sustainably fished or underfished. And the size of the circle obviously has to do with the extent of the overfishing or the underfishing. And as you can see, there has definitely been a change between 2002 and 2011. And if you kind of look at kind of obviously the result of the common fisheries policies, at the moment 53% is actually kind of fished sustainably, so 53% of stocks. But also you can probably see that the green circles have increased and the red circles generally have decreased. So in addition to individual stocks not being any longer overfished, there's also a change in dynamics. And if you then actually look at those 3 kind of countries, kind of the Greenland, Icelandic, Faroes, and Norwegian Sea, which actually don't adhere to any common fisheries policy because they are not within this kind of EU kind of policy, they are actually not, although they say they're very kind of sustainable, they're not. And actually, if you kind of leave this out, then we're actually 61% of our stocks are actually sustainably fished. So I think in this sense, the common fishery policies have worked, but this is obviously an area we have to kind of keep a really close eye on. So this is for kind of the North Sea, what happens kind of worldwide. This is kind of a diagram from the FAO. And you can see that kind of, we are still having a huge problem with kind of stocks that are overfished. And it's still, I think it has stabilized a bit, but it's still kind of, it was actually increasing up till very recently. Then the fully fished is actually kind of quite constant, and the underfished is actually going down. So there is still a problem with overfished. So, but if you look at wild catch, it is kind of going to be a problem. It's a problem now, it's going to be a problem in the future. But increasingly, we're turning to aquaculture. So this is another graph from the FAO. And it actually kind of, if you look at the light gray area, this is the food fish supply from the capture fisheries. And you can see actually from the 1990s, this has been reasonably stable. So we haven't really increased our fish supply from wild catch. But kind of from around 1990 onwards, the increase of the supply from aquaculture has really, really significantly increased. And at the moment, this is 2012, but if you kind of would merge the results from 2014 in there, we kind of almost half of the fish we currently eat is from aquaculture and not from wild catch fisheries. And as you can see, kind of the population growth here and then the per capita fish consumption, that is actually kind of going quite in parallel. So at the moment, we can produce the fish that people would need, but only kind of if you take into consideration the sources we get from aquaculture. However, there is a bit of a caveat. Oh no, I will go to climate change first. So this is just a graph where you can see the effects of the future of climate change and how that may affect fish stocks. And as you can see kind of from this colored graphs, kind of the tropical areas, it's generally predicted that the fish stocks are going down in the future. But in the Arctic, more Arctic areas, the fish stocks will be going up. So there will be fish stocks moving from the tropical regions into kind of areas where we are living. So I think for us it would probably be quite a good scenario, future scenario. But generally, and this has been a study which is Fish to 2030, which looks at, they are normally running a model for policy analysis on agricultural commodities and trade impact. And they say, like, they expect to 2030 that the growth will be 24% for the fisheries between 2010 and 2030. And the world population will only grow by 20%. So we should be able to kind of stay in pace with being able to provide more fish for a growing world population. But I have to say, this will have to come from aquaculture. The targets for increasing growth in aquaculture are immense. And even sometimes the aquaculture industry doesn't know how they're going to do that. So that's quite a challenging area. But I said there was a caveat, and one of the caveats is that if you look at the aquaculture, like if you look at the fish they produce, basically a fish is food in, is food out. They can't make their own omega-3 fatty acids. They will have to get that through the diet. So if you actually feed them less omega-3 fatty acids, a fish will actually contain less omega-3 fatty acids. And this is actually a graph from a colleague from Stirling, Matthew Sprague, and he has actually looked at, they have been involved in a lot of feeding trials over the last 10 years. And they've looked at the amount of EPA and DHA in the fish. And as you can see, there has been a significant decline. So initially, kind of most of the fish would be fed kind of a diet rich in fish meal, fish oil. And now they're increasingly incorporating vegetable oil, but also protein sources from vegetables into the fish kind of feeds. Which means that, like, if you look at EPA and DHA concentration, they have almost halved in the last 10 years. So all the studies that we now have, where I showed you kind of where you look at fish consumption and total mortality, if that included these fish, these were probably kind of harvested around this time where the EPA and DHA concentration would have been a lot higher. So yeah, there are some issues that we have to address, because if the EPA and DHA concentrations are going down, that will probably have a knock-on effect on the health properties of fish as well. So that's exactly what we wanted to kind of look at. Like, if we're looking at different fish that are more kind of, and they call it more sustainable, but in a way, if you introduce kind of plant protein and plant oils into the fish diet, it is more sustainable. It's cheaper as well for the aquaculture company. So that's obviously kind of a main kind of motivating factor for changing the feeds. So what we did is we thought, what we're going to do, we're going to grow salmon, but we're going to grow two different salmon. So one, we called it high in pure fat, so they were fed the traditional high fish meal, fish oil diets. And then we had kind of another pen of salmon where we fed more modern diets, where kind of a lot of the fish oil was replaced by vegetable oil, and the fish meal was staying the same. And then we were going to give this fish, kind of the salmon, we were going to give portions, 2 portions per week, to our volunteers. There were kind of about 20 volunteers in each group. And so kind of one group would get kind of 2 portions per week of the H. pufa salmon. One group would get 2 portions per week of the S. pufa salmon. And then one group, it's always difficult to find a good control for such intervention. So we decided we're not going to give anything. We'll just, so all these people were going to get this on top of their habitual fish consumption. Most of them in Scotland, they don't eat a lot of fish. So they were quite low habitual consumers anyway. But the control group did not get any additional fish. And they were going to do this for 18 weeks because we know that time period is necessary for fish fatty acids to be incorporated in membranes. And then we took blood samples, fecal samples, urine samples at 0 weeks, 9 weeks, and 18 weeks. So this was actually quite a bit different because it was not just doing the human study, it was also kind of growing the fish. So it actually took us to the west coast of Scotland and very close to kind of Fort William, quite a number of times. So we kind of teamed up with a team from Stirling. This was our team, and we were going there quite frequently. We sampled fish and we were just seeing whether they were growing according to our specifications. And then obviously we fed them the 2 different diets that were developed also with the Stirling people and with Biomar, who is one of the main fish feed providers. And we actually kind of fed them to 2 specifications. So the H. pufa salmon, they had high levels of EPA and DHA, which was about 15% of total feed fatty acids. And this is very similar to what you would get in wild salmon. And then we had a sustainable salmon, which was about half the amount of EPA and DHA. And this is actually what you will find currently in the supermarkets. And we didn't want to be politically incorrect, but we said this is similar to most Norwegian salmon because they were actually the first to introduce the more sustainable diets. So this is actually how the salmon looked like. So they were the same in protein, they were the same in carbohydrates, there were some differences in fat. So the high pufa salmon had a little bit more saturated fat, but less monounsaturated fat. But the biggest difference was in the EPA and DHA content, and this was exactly as we had predicted it would be the case. So we looked at, obviously kind of during the 18 weeks, we looked at the intake of EPA and DHA. So we had food diaries, we looked at kind of the fish they got through the trial, but they would eat some additional fish as well. And we've expressed it as milligram per kilogram body weight per week. And we looked at the omega-3 index, which is basically the total amount of EPA and DHA as a ratio of total fatty acids and red blood cells. And as you can see, there was quite a lot of variability. Kind of this is the control group, the red is the H. pufa group, and the green one is the S. pufa group. Oh no, the other way around, sorry, the lead is here. But there was quite a strong correlation kind of between those regimes, outcomes. And we found some other interesting outcomes as well. So obviously we looked at triglycerides because fish is known to lower triglyceride. But surprisingly, the triglycerides were only lowered in the S. pufa group, so who had only half the amount of EPA and DHA, and not so much in the high pufa group. And as they started kind of from a different level, we also looked at the change different from the baseline. And as you can see, it is indeed the S. pufa group that caused a lowering in triglycerides. We looked at pulse. We know heartbeat is another outcome that fish oil is affecting. Here we did find the main effect was due to H. pufa and not to S. pufa. And again, this is the change from the baseline. It is mostly down to kind of taking in salmon with like a high levels of EPA and DHA. But our main outcome was the omega-3 index. So the omega-3 index has always been an intake biomarker, but increasingly it's also a biomarker for cardiovascular health. And this was the difference in baseline. So generally, if you're below 4%, people are thinking you have a higher increase, a risk of cardiovascular disease. If you're above 8%, you're actually quite all right. And you've got an intermediate factor, which is 2 to 8. And you can see in Scotland where we are, most of the people were, it was a huge variability, but on average it was about 5.2, which is similar as what you would find in Ireland as well and in the USA. This is not necessarily relating to fish consumption, mostly are, but for example, I was one of the participants and I think I was about 7.8, but my fish intake is really, really low, so there must be a genetic factor kind of involved as well, which is very interesting. So if you look at the omega-3 index, so this is kind of basically a change from 0 weeks to 9 weeks to 18 weeks, and you can see both are actually going up, H. pufa and S. pufa, but the change is quite parallel. And if you look at the change from baseline, So at the beginning you would expect, because the HPU for salmon has more EPA and DHA, so it goes up more significantly than the people that were eating the SPU for salmon. But after 18 weeks, there was actually not much of a difference between the two groups. So both salmon were able to kind of almost equally increase the omega-3 index. So it almost looks there is a bit of a kind of a satiety effect. So you really don't need to increase your fish intake much more beyond that, because your omega-3 index will probably not be too much different. So actually, when I discussed this with the aquaculture industry, they said this was actually really interesting for them, because that means that they can actually kind of take different feeding regimes forward without actually compromising too much on the health benefits, at least for the omega-3 index. So if you look at actually kind of what has changed on the fatty acid levels, for those of you who are interested in the fatty acid analysis, so we saw obviously there was an increase in EPA and DHA. This is EPA, this is DHA, both in the H-PUFA group and the S-PUFA group. And this was at the cost of arachidonic acid and at the cost of linoleic acid. So we thought if there is like such dramatic changes in individual fatty acids, there may be changes in kind of and metabolites that derive from these fatty acids in the body as well. So we did lipidomic analysis with Jackie Lee in Hong Kong. So we sent her kind of 24 hours urine, and she did lipidomic analysis for us. And that was quite interesting. So she looked at the whole range. I think she looked at about 25 different lipidomic markers, and mostly are kind of compounds that are actually either enzymatically or non-enzymatically derived from fatty acids. So here you've got kind of two hetes, which are kind of enzymatic kind of products of arachidonic acid, and these are normally kind of considered kind of inflammatory. And we found a huge variability between subjects, which we know is happening, but there was actually kind of after 18 weeks quite a consistent effect in that the H-PUFA was actually almost the same as control, but the S-PUFA increased the compounds kind of significantly. And we don't know why. It's the same with kind of there are two, an isoprostane and an isoprostane metabolite, which are indicators of whole body oxidative stress, which were again increased in the S-PUFA group and not in the H-PUFA group. And we don't know exactly why. It may have something to do with the fact that the S-PUFA salmon were fed a lot more alpha-linolenic acid, because that's obviously kind of more prominent in plant-based kind of oil. And we know that if you have rapeseed oil, for example, which is very high in alpha-linolenic acid, if you fry that, you get more oxidation products. So we don't know whether that has anything to do with it, but it is potentially quite interesting. So although we said if we would just look at the omega-3 index, we would think that both regimes were the same. If you then actually go into detail and looking at the lipidomic profile, they are actually quite different in their outcomes. Another interesting outcome was actually vitamin D, in that we followed vitamin D, kind of different subjects started at different times, but this is the control group, and as you can see, both H-PUFA and S-PUFA were actually increasing vitamin D status kind of above the control level, which was really interesting. And also if you kind of correlated kind of the change in the omega-3 index as a marker of fish intake and the change in serum vitamin D3 status, there was quite a good correlation. So there is actually evidence, and that is not only in this study but also in other papers, that if people eat more fish there, that could be actually something to improve their vitamin D status. And that is important because increasingly people in the UK are getting kind of having low levels of vitamin D, so low vitamin D status. And there are emerging cases of rickets again as well. This is actually a Neolithic skeleton on Tiree, which was found kind of last year, and indicating even rickets existing 5,000 years ago, which is quite interesting because you would think that would be quite a rural out kind of community that was just out on the land all the time. But obviously this woman must have been confined in house. But even nowadays there are people that are, obviously children are not as often outdoors as anymore as they used to be. There's certain kind of groups, elderly, that are confined indoors, or people that have to cover up because of religious reasons. So actually vitamin D is very important, and the second will also come with a new recommendation, I think in a month's time, relating to vitamin D intake. So I think it is quite timely to consider vitamin D, especially in relation to fish intake. So the conclusion from this study is that, we have actually shown that if you kind of take fish rather than supplements, then they do modulate risk factors for cardiovascular disease. And if you kind of have 2 portions per week, it doesn't really matter whether you have kind of the salmon kind of that's based on high fish meal, fish oil, or salmon that has more sustainable patterns, because they both will actually increase the omega-3 index quite similarly. However, there are differences in that lipidomic profiles were different, so it may well be that if you increase alpha-linolenic acid, may not necessarily kind of give you kind of the effect you had wished for from a perspective of inflammation and oxidative stress. So this will take me to the last couple of slides I've got as what people are actually eating and how does it fit with current and future recommendations. So there have been changes in fish consumption. This is actually a graph which is based on purchase level, so this is kind of derived from Kantar data. And as you can see, from 1974 up till 2014, kind of where in 1974 people were eating about 44 grams per week of whitefish, this has really dramatically lowered to about 19 grams per week nowadays. So consumption of whitefish has really decreased. On the other hand, we have taken up salmon. I think the consumption of salmon has increased about 5-fold. And also the consumption of shellfish has increased about 5-fold. So obviously we have diversified, which is probably quite good from a perspective that salmon will actually provide you with more omega-3 fatty acids, and shellfish will provide you with more vitamin B12, vitamin D, kind of, and iodine, and other micronutrients. So if you look at kind of what the current recommendations are, and we've just kind of chosen a couple of key countries. So the black bars are the recommendations. And you can see kind of Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Spain, UK and USA. Even the recommendations, they're all based on the same scientific literature, but they're quite different between the countries. And mostly countries where fish consumption is very high, kind of in Spain and in Norway, kind of the recommendations are quite high as well. So the first two bars are actually data, intake data from the EPIC study that was only done once in the 90s, so maybe a bit out of date. So the last two bars, kind of, again, this is kind of for females and males, has been done based on more recent kind of dietary intake data. And as you can see, kind of in Germany, people are definitely, they are only kind of consuming about half of recommendations. The Netherlands, they're not sticking to it. We know there were no official data, but I think the data are lower than the recommendations. That's why they actually halved it recently. Norway and Spain, they're actually kind of eating more than recommended intakes. UK, we're not eating enough, and the same for the USA. But I have to say that generally kind of the population can be divided in two kind of groups, kind of people that eat fish and people that don't eat fish at all because they don't like it. So the people that eat fish are generally sticking to recommendations, whereas the people who don't eat fish, that obviously kind of really lower the average intake across the population. So who eats actually the fish? And here I've actually kind of, this is NDNS data we got from the UK, and we actually kind of narrowed it down to different age groups. And that is actually a bit worrying, because if you look at the percentage of women and percentage of men eating fish, so kind of here, the blue ones are no, the red ones are yes. It's actually really the elderly that are eating a lot of fish, and the younger generations hardly eat any fish, like sometimes less than half. Same for men. And the figures are even worse for oily fish. So there are some elderly, kind of obviously kind of the percentages are a lot lower, but there are the elderly eating most. But if you look at the younger generation, they hardly eat any fish. So obviously if the demographics shifts, then we are probably ending up with a population that really don't stick to recommendations at all, because the younger generation just doesn't eat as much fish as the older generation. Where do we buy our fish? This is kind of data we got from Kantar. And if you look at fresh salmon, this is only for salmon, fresh smoked salmon and frozen salmon, but you can see the blue bars are the supermarkets, and then there are some of the fishmonger as well, but really kind of the largest part of a fish comes from the supermarket. And it's actually the supermarkets that sell the salmon that are sustainably farmed from Norway most of the time, and increasingly from Scotland as well. So the fishmonger will give you kind of more like the wild products that are actually quite rich in EPA and DHA. But the supermarkets are just often the products that are quite low in EPA and DHA. And if that is our main source of fish fatty acids, then that means that has consequences for the amount of fish fatty acids we consume. So if we consider kind of the lowering of EPA and DHA in the salmon we produce in the shops, especially for the supermarket. So if you look at the significant changes, so kind of it's basically a decrease in EPA and DHA in farmed salmon, and the fact that we increasingly buy the salmon in the supermarkets and not to the fishmonger, that means that the average intake of omega-3 fatty acids in the Western population is probably lower than it was before, also considering the demographics. It's especially the older people eating the fish and not the younger. So obviously this have consequences for future dietary recommendations, because the EPA and DHA intake that we think people have is probably a lot lower. So I will finish with kind of a case for shellfish, because we were recently successful in getting over £1 million worth of funding from the Scottish Government to establish the health effects of eating shellfish in collaboration with the shellfish kind of industry in Scotland. So we are trying to kind of answer kind of 3 questions. Kind of, first of all, if you look at shellfish, because shellfish have always lost out a bit on the omega-3 health benefits, because obviously they have actually really high levels of omega-3 fatty acids, but their fat content is so low. So the total amount of EPA and DHA is relatively low. So they've always lost out on the recommendations. But also there is obviously kind of the problem with the toxins. So kind of the Food Standards Agency in the UK have always kind of stayed clear from shellfish a bit. But like the ambition for the shellfish industry to kind of grow are kind of immense, and also kind of we know that the population are increasingly eating shellfish. And it's relatively cheap. If you look, for example, at mussels, you can actually buy a portion of mussels for kind of around kind of probably kind of between €1 and €2. And if you look actually at the sustainability issues, mussels, they actually absorb CO2. So they are kind of carbon negative. So it's a very sustainable kind of source of fish. So, but we have very little information about kind of the nutrients that are in shellfish, and especially how that varies across the year. So that's something we're going to establish. We're also going to look at if people are increasing their consumption of shellfish, does it actually improve nutritional status in relation to fish, omega-3 fatty acids, but also vitamin D and vitamin B12, which are really prominent in shellfish. And we will actually get some personalized nutrition as well, because we obviously know that people may need perhaps a trigger to kind of eat more shellfish because they don't know how to cook it, or they're not kind of familiar with eating it. So we're actually going to see whether increased knowledge about the personal requirements actually modulate behavior of shellfish consumption. So this will all happen in the next 5 years. It's a 5-year program. And then in my last slide, I would like to kind of acknowledge all the people we have been working with as part of this program. So it's people at the University of Aberdeen, and mostly my colleague Alan Snedden, who is a micronutrient kind of specialist, but also with my colleague Ingeborg Brouwer at the Free University in Amsterdam, the people in Stirling who are obviously very much involved with fish feeds and how that affects fish health and fish composition, Biomar, which produced kind of the fish diets for us in marine harvest that facilitated the growing of the fish. University of Hong Kong has done the lipidomics analysis, the BIOS, who are our statistical experts, but obviously, very importantly, the Scottish Government, who have been now kind of funding, giving us a second round of 5 years of funding to look at the effects of fish and health, for which we are very grateful. Okay, thank you.